I want you to get together.
Hello everyone. I have another random off-the-cuff rumination for you guys today. And this one comes from a bit of a personal experience, but it's led from one train of thought to another. To me thinking about a concept which I think would fit nicely into my Nephilim Look Like Clowns research. Now this concept came when I was basically listening to my toddler son cry in the back seat of a car while driving home. He was hungry and tired and just wanted to get out of the chair, wasn't comfortable, and it was a long journey home. Now, while he was screaming and crying and moaning during this time, as toddlers tend to do, my wife was in the back, trying to basically stop him from climbing out of his car seat and also trying to make him laugh. And this is the thing. I watched him as he changed from uncontrollable sobbing and whining instantly to laughter, as my wife did something funny to distract him. And watching this sudden shift from screaming and crying in anguish to laughing hysterically with joy at such a sudden change of pace made me contemplate a certain idea which has been bandied around recently by people I've been talking to and interviewing with, which have got me thinking about the idea of energy vampires and demons. So, you may have heard this, it's a new age concept, but if you haven't already, there's this idea that there are spiritual beings in the astral realm, let's say, or even in the physical realm, I suppose, which are known as energetic vampires to the new age cult, let's call it. They believe that there are entities out there that feed on negative energy. And their entire goal and purpose really is to make people feel extreme anguish, pain, or fear. And once that fear has reached a crescendo in the individual, they will drain them of all their energy and feed off this fear. They call this energy Loosh. Now, the origins of Loosh are irrelevant in terms of where the word comes from. I think they say it has some kind of French origin to the word louche, which sounds similar. But this idea that there are demons, let's call them, or entities of some kind that purposefully torture their victims and distill fear within them in order to feed off their energy, isn't exactly a new concept, and it's a concept we've seen banded around through a lot of media as well. But before we get to that, let's just go back a second and consider this idea that laughter and crying can be switched so quickly. What's going on here? So I found out about this affliction called the pseudobulbar effect. So just going off a quick description of what this is off a medical website, it's a condition that's characterized by episodes of sudden, uncontrollable and inappropriate laughing or crying. Pseudobulbar effect typically occurs in people with certain neurological conditions or injuries which might affect the way the brain controls emotion. If you have pseudobulbar effect, you'll experience emotions normally, but you'll sometimes express them in exaggerated or inappropriate ways. As a result, the condition can be embarrassing and disruptive to your daily life. Pseudobulbar effect often goes undiagnosed or is mistaken for mood disorders. Once diagnosed, however, pseudobulbar effect can be managed with medication. So this is interesting. This is actually some kind of illness people can get in which they can't really control their laughter or crying. It just happens and they just cannot stop, no matter how hard they try. And I think it's interesting that it's both. It's laughter and crying. It's anguish and happiness that the mind can't control and it switches between. So this implies to me that there is this intrinsic link between happiness and sadness. The primary sign of pseudobulbar effect is frequent involuntary and uncontrollable outbursts of crying or laughing that are exaggerated or not connected to your emotional state. Laughter often turns to tears. Your mood will appear normal between episodes, which can occur at any time. crying appears to be a more common sign of BPA than laughing. The degree of emotional response caused by PBA is often striking, with laughing or crying lasting up to several minutes. For example, you might laugh uncontrollably in response to a mildly amusing comment, or you might laugh or cry in situations that others don't see as funny or sad. These emotional responses typically represent a change from how you would have previously responded. Because pseudobulbar effect often involves crying, the condition is frequently mistaken for depression. However, PBA episodes tend to be short in duration, while depression causes a persistent feeling of sadness. Also, people with PBA often lack certain features of depression, such as sleep disturbances or loss of appetite. But depression is common among those who have pseudobulbar effect. So not all people who are depressed have pseudobulbar effect, but almost all people who have pseudobulbar effect are depressed. It's one of those situations, which is hardly surprising. This is a very depressing affliction to have. So that's what it says here. It says the causes of this could be people with neurological conditions or injuries, such as having a stroke, multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injuries, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease. So I was looking into this a bit more, and I was reminded, and it came to my own memory, that didn't the Joker have this illness in the recent Joker with Joaquin Phoenix? So, the Joker in this, it does say that indeed Arthur Fleck, the character of the Joker in this movie, did have this illness, and he couldn't help but laugh uncontrollably. And it even caused him, a lot of trouble to get, beaten up, basically, for not being able to shut up when he needed to. And it does say, actually, he has this because his mother and her partner beat him after chaining him up to a radiator. So it's due to a traumatic blunt force trauma to the head that he has this affliction. But I find it interesting, of course, that this idea of uncontrollable laughter or uncontrollable crying is linked to a clown-like character in the mainstream media. We think of a clown, don't we, as a fun-loving, happy character who brings joy and laughter to people. But we also have this other concept of the sad clown. The clown that, is actually depressed on the inside but acts happy on the outside. I think one popular example of this, which people often turn to, is the idea of Robin Williams, this person who supposedly brought so much joy to people through his comedy movies but sadly ended his own life. But this was also a myth that was brought up in President Nixon's speech when he declared that the 1st to the 7th of August would be National Clown Week. So, that little tidbit aside in regards to this concept that, Arthur Fleck, the Joker, had this debilitating disorder where he couldn't stop laughing or crying uncontrollably when these bouts happened due to a traumatic head injury. This idea, that the brain is linked with laughing and crying very closely. There's something close about these two. They're pretty much the same thing. So I found a study in which it's basically explaining that it's the cerebellum which controls this aspect. And it's finding that this part of the brain basically controls these two emotions. So they are closely linked together and extremely similar. It's the same parts of the brain that make this happen. So if I go into read here about this hypothesis, about what's going on here, it says, laughter and crying are complex patterns of movements that are usually integral parts of the enactment of specific emotions. Laughter is normally a part of the enactment of happiness. True laughter tends not to occur in a context of sadness. And crying is normally a part of the enactment of sadness, although it is possible to cry in the context of happiness. The pattern of crying is distinct in that it does not include sobbing, as it tends to appear as a hybrid of laughter and crying. So I know it's saying here, you can cry with happiness, and sobbing seems to be this weird hybrid of laughter and crying. It's as though our brain can't distinguish the bodily muscle functions between the two extreme feelings. So we express it basically through the same way. I found it interesting, this idea, whenever I was at a carnival, let's say, or a festival when I was young, you would hear all this screaming of joy, as people, enjoy the festival and scream for their band, and these huge crowds of people all dancing and enjoying themselves. But I always felt if you closed your eyes and truly listened to these screams, you could equally apply it to the sounds of those wailing and gnashing their teeth in hell. The distinction is hard to make on such a vast and loud scale, let's say. So what I'm basically trying to say with this is there's something about laughter and crying and energy. So there's this idea, like I said, in the New Age culture of Loosh. That there's these entities in the spirit realm that like to generate energy in humans and then feed off that energy. And mostly it's been depicted in movies as fear energy. So this idea, like let's say It from Stephen King's, book titled the same thing. There's this Pennywise the clown, this entity known as It. And this entity takes the form of a clown merely because it knows it's the fear of an individual it's torturing in order to get the individual to feel fear, which it feeds off of. So it's an energetic, fear-feeding beast. It's not actually a clown, it's actually some kind of giant spider monster, if you've ever read the book and found that out. But it's this interdimensional being that can manifest more powerful the more fear that is generated, and it then feeds, once it takes physical form, on the flesh of its victims. But in order to manifest physically, it needs to feed off the energy it produces through fear first. Which is an interesting concept. But I was thinking about this idea. What if it's also laughter energy? And of course, what I'm referencing here, of course, is Monsters, Inc. And I think they were maybe telling us something in this Charles movie, which was, fitting for my theory. The idea that it doesn't matter what the energy is necessarily, as long as it's generated in the individual. So in this world of Monsters, Inc., if you don't know, if you haven't watched this film by now, it's basically interdimensional monsters, or beasts, who live in a parallel reality to the human world, use portals to the human world in order to enter a child's room. And what they do is they generate fear in the child by scaring them, because that scream energy is then stored in a canister in their dimension, and then they use that energy to fuel their world. So basically, they feed off the energy of fear. They get this, the twist is they soon discover laugh energy is far more powerful. So they switch and become comedians who go to this other dimension to make children laugh. And then they use the laugh energy from then on to fuel their society. So I think they've told you there, it doesn't matter necessarily whether it's fear energy or laugh energy. As long as the energy is produced, they can feed. And we live in such a clown world today. Everything is irreverent, if you haven't noticed. Everything is a joke. Everything is a meme layered under 10 layers of irony. And I think there's something about this manifestation of the demonic that comes through as the jester or the joker or the clown into our world, especially spiritual manifestations that come through the possessed, let's say. So the New Age call it Loosh, and they call them energetic vampires. They're still under that bizarre delusion that there are good and bad entities in the spirit realm, not understanding that the realm that they're talking about is essentially now a prison for the Nephilim. And there aren't many, if any, good entities there. But this idea, of Loosh, of taking the energy from their victims, is something I discussed with the author, Vicky Joy Anderson. And when we were having our conversation when she was last on my channel, we were talking about this whole energetic vampire situation and Loosh. And we were referencing Jerry Marzinski's work as well, someone else I had a talk with about this. And he said, Jerry Marzinski, that the schizophrenics he works with in prisons, in the prison system mainly, he worked with these people for decades. As a psychiatrist, he came to the conclusion that these things on the other side are demonic. And he would say that the victims he would work with would say that they not only heard voices, but they would also be made to be put into a state of incredible fear. And then they would suddenly feel like all their energy had just been drained from them, and they would essentially just be lifeless. They would have no energy to move. They would just feel so fatigued and drained utterly. And this would keep happening to the schizophrenics. And it's as though, obviously, these entities were feeding off his energy. So, I'm inclined to believe that there is this aspect to the Nephilim spirits, the demons on the other side, where they feed off energy. I am starting to realise that the clown itself is an interesting character in the role of this. So I've already established that demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, and the Nephilim had features which looked like a clown that we would call today. And my theory also states that a modern day clown is actually a creation with the sole purpose and intention to mimic the way the Nephilim looked. It's a caricature, a costume of the Nephilim. And in cultures all around the world who worship their ancestor spirits, which are these disembodied spirits of the Nephilim or demons, they also dress in clownish-like clothing because they are trying to attract the demon to them in order to be possessed by the demon. And to do that, they wear clothing which looks like them. Now in the West, that's what we do. We wear a clown costume, and we are therefore invocating the demon to come into us, whether you know it or not. My theory, which I hope I've proved by now, is that, the clown was invented for this purpose, so the society wouldn't realise that they were summoning demons, but those who created it, they know full well what this costume does, and that's what they use it for, so they can hide in plain sight, and people would just think it's something fun for the kids. Now imagine a clown. It's a creature in the West that makes people laugh. However, children are utterly terrified of them. And I found that there are plenty of studies that have been done which basically say kids don't like clowns. There's some kind of deep instinctual fear and repulsion of them. It's the opposite. But some people find clowns hilarious, and they're, a creature of joy and happiness. They're a symbol of mirth, shall we say. And we all know that the Royal Order of the Jesters consider mirth as king. That's the logo. The Royal Order of Jesters being a step above the Shriners, who have their own clowns to do with their sex for every region wherever they exist. They dress like clowns, and they go to the children's hospitals. And obviously you can't be a Shriner unless you're already a high-level Freemasonry. I think the phrase for the Royal Order of the Jesters, mirth is king, might be hinting that the best source of energy for the demons is laughter. So there's something sinister about this. I'm basically, I've inadvertently made laughter a scary thing now. Because as I was mentioning earlier, I was talking to Vicky Joy Anderson about this, and she mentioned to me that it's not just fear that these demons use to generate energy which they then drain from their victims. It's also sexual pleasure. And this is the idea of the wet dream, let's say, or this idea that they come to you in your dream and have sex with you in order to generate that sexual energy. And obviously, once they make you orgasm, they drain all the energy from you. And that's another way of doing it. It's pleasure as well, not just pain. So it's laughter and happiness and sadness and fear. It's pain or it's pleasure. It doesn't matter how the energy is produced, as long as it is produced. So, a clown can either make you laugh, or it will have the other opposite violent reaction of making you cry or recoil in fear. It doesn't matter what the result is, it gets its energy. So it seems like the clown is the perfect creation for this purpose. you get those people who, in the shrines, let's say, who dress like demons. We call them clowns, but what they're really doing is dressing like the ancestor spirits of folk traditions. It's the same practice. Then they go to these children and they either make them laugh or make them cry with fear. And what they're doing while channeling the demons through them is they're giving the energy to the demon. The demon then feeds off the child's laughter, or it feeds off the child's fear. So I think there's something to this, and all this came from just a random thought of seeing my son scream with pain to then suddenly laughing with joy within a split second, almost as though it was the same emotion. So yeah, what do you guys think about this concept? This concept that, laughter or sadness and fear produce the same energy in an individual. And as long as that energy is produced, the demon is fed. So we find, in society, comedy is a huge deal, and just like every other industry in the world, it's as corrupt as the next one. And the things that they have made funny now are the most rude, crass, and evil things imaginable, and our sense of humour has become darker and darker. And maybe there's something about that corruption of humour in people, which means as long as people are laughing hysterically, or are crying hysterically, it's fine, Because hysteria is another point of this. It's paradoxical laughter. The inability to stop laughing once laughing, is to be hysterical. And it's interesting. I could go on about this probably in more detail for a long time. But one thing I will say, which is interesting, is mania is a form of bipolar disorder where people erratically switch from insanely happy, to insanely sad and all sorts of other things, But once people have this bout of mania, we call it, where the emotions are riding really high and incredibly low in such a rapid succession for about an hour or so, it's common that fatigue is a huge problem for people who suffer from this mania. And once their mind has been racing, it brings insomnia with it as well, a huge lack of sleep. And it takes a long time to recover from mania. And it says here, so you can end up feeling physically and emotionally drained during the recovery as well. So whether the demon is forcing somebody through some kind of mental illness to have bouts of extreme highs and lows and emotions to the point where they end up feeling utterly drained of all their energy, or whether they are using their paid actors in the world to make somebody laugh hysterically or make somebody cry hysterically, or to torture somebody and cause pain, or to, pleasure somebody and cause immense pleasure. It doesn't matter to the demon. As long as the energy is produced, they will drain you of that energy. I mean, this goes back to Hellraiser as well now I think about it. These Cenobites who basically live in hell, or the other dimension, which is like a nightmarish realm, well, they love to either cause extreme pain or pleasure to individuals, and they find extreme pleasure in the pain, hence why they tear themselves with hooks and rip their own flesh off and do disturbing things to themselves, because they gain pleasure from it. But they've elevated it in the world to a priestly order, and they have a religious concept of this pain and pleasure. It's not simply just about sex, it's actually about something serious to them. And I do believe what I'm saying here, it may be hitting on this point, that pain or pleasure to them is where they get their energy, And it seems to have been referenced everywhere in the more extreme adult content like It or, Hellraiser, as I just said. But even in the children's programming such as Monsters, Inc., it's a big deal. So yeah, the clown can manifest extreme happiness in an individual or extreme fear. And it doesn't matter which one it generates. The clown is happy. The demon is happy. The demon within the individual who is channeling it by wearing the clown costume gets its food. So yeah, I'll leave that there for you guys to ponder and think about, guys. I didn't think this maybe warranted being an episode of the Nephilim Look Like Clowns series, but it's definitely a concept that I've been mulling over recently, which I think is just fascinating and an interesting piece to add to the puzzle. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, you can always support me on Patreon, and you can also support the book by following the links down below to the GoFundMe. I'll be back later this week with more videos. I've got a few things lined up in the works to make yet. But I hope you've enjoyed this little fun conversation, guys. Thanks for listening, and as always, God bless.
I want you to get together